Although we can't be here together in person, I still want to take a moment to appreciate the Indigenous lands that we're on. Quote, our stories were us, where we came from, where we were going. Here, Barbara Levy of the Quechuan tribe beautifully encapsulate what storytelling means to Indigenous around the globe. Hopefully, everyone here has acknowledged Indigenous lands before. However, when was the last time you truly listened to an Indigenous story to genuinely understand their tribulations? Working in the California Air Resources Board Environmental Justice Unit this past summer, I learned how impactful storytelling can be. Today, take a journey with me as we expose ourselves to Indigenous stories, learn about their power, and understand the overarching trends of Indigenous storytelling. As with any story, let's start at the beginning. Predating even written word, Indigenous people passed down traditional stories and culture through folktale, songs, chants, artifacts, and ceremonies. Indigenous people live in harmony with the earth, which they consider sacred. As Harrison Harper put it, tribal communities live in ethno-habitat. That is, they feel a stronger physical, emotional, and spiritual connection to the earth than anyone else. This is what my history books taught me. A dive into our first example of storytelling, however, paints a different picture. I had the pleasure to interview Ron Reed of the Karut tribe. Here, he tells the story of his tribe through a timeline. While we don't have time to read its content, the key takeaway is that our Eurocentric school system conveniently omits this history of forced assimilation and genocide. Since the late 1400s, indigenous people have been stripped of their cultural, spiritual, and environmental rights, forced off their sacred lands, and exploited for natural resources. This raises severe environmental justice issues. Environmental justice, or EJ for short, embraces the principle that all people have a right to equitable environmental conditions. Despite political marginalization, indigenous EJ advocates strive to protect their lands, heritages, and cultures through storytelling. With this foundation, let's move on to real-life storytelling trends and examples. The oldest trend of storytelling is traditional. Traditional indigenous storytelling is oral, intergenerational, and interactive way of passing down culture and heritage. Yamades contends that most unique tribe techniques, quote, share several commonalities that have given rise to the use of indigenous storytelling as a distinct term, end quote. At its core, indigenous storytelling is an art form, known for its rich oral tradition, relational at its core. Many stories are gained from animals, plants, the moon, the stars, the wind, water. According to McGregor, oral storytelling creates solidarity with the natural world. For indigenous people, their native lands are the only place they can practice their religion. When their lands are destroyed for dams, railroads, and pipelines, they lose the ability to translate their culture and traditions intergenerationally. Thus, environmental degradation quite literally destroys their way of life. In terms of oral storytelling, Isiki explains that there are three levels of storytelling. One, sacred stories, which are specific in form and content and structure. Two, mythical stories. These teach morals, lessons, and events. And three, personal stories, often taught by elders to teach and counsel. Oral storytelling is absolutely fundamental to who Indigenous are. Storytelling serves purposes of passing down culturally built knowledge and shared history, while simultaneously instilling moral values. Further, Indigenous storytelling is fundamental in biocultural preservation, as it teaches observers Indigenous worldviews, facilitates dialogue of environmental issues, and promotes collaboration and conservation. Now, let's dissect an example of real-life storytelling. Ron Reed and I discussed in depth about his tribe's traditional salmon ceremony, where he transmits history and culture to his 5 children. Many years ago, there was an abundance of fish and salmon to last all 4 seasons. Salmon was a crucial part of everything they did, and it held great religious value. Now, anthropogenic events like climate change and dam construction have severely reduced the salmon population. Now, Ron fears lack of salmon will impact the ceremony. Salmon ceremony was significant in teaching its people the importance of living off the land, being one with nature, and appreciating coexistence with the great creator. Ron feels that systemic racism has, quote, stripped us of our integrity, sense of well being, and sense of identity. Even with limited access, Ron stressed his commitment to continuing the ceremony until there was no spring salmon left. As is the case with the Karuk tribe, oral storytelling evidently remains an incredibly large part of Indigenous life and advocacy. While oral storytelling is a root of Indigenous environmental storytelling, it has limited reach due to its in-person nature. This is where a relatively recent second trend comes in: digital storytelling. Through the use of photography, story maps, film, and social media, Indigenous EJ advocates are able to reach a broader audience. In the word of Reed, digital media has changed the way that tribes communicate with the youth and masses. Now let's dive into an example of digital storytelling. Here is the story map Voices of the Grand Canyon, which combines geography, photographs, videos, audio, and maps to tell stories. Story maps are easily accessible and a click away from exploring. Voices of the Grand Canyon collaborates with 5 individuals, working with each one to tell their story and speak their truth. Rather than hearing me talk, let's listen together to the voices of the Grand Canyon.
Casca. I'm a member of the Havasupai tribe. My people, Havsupaja, which means people of the blue-green waters. My parents have always told me about this area when I was growing up in the village of Supai. Right now, the National Park Service is celebrating their centennial year of 100 years being a national park. But for my people and other tribes surrounding this area, it's really not a celebration. Once it became a national park, my people were restricted from this area. An area about south of here called the Red Butte area, Wikaruisa. It is our place of emergence. Whereas when the world was flooded with so much water, they put this little girl in a canoe or a boat where she floated for days. But that's where she landed at Red Butte, the top of Red Butte. So that is our place of emergence. And Red Butte area for my people is a traditional cultural property to this day. Anybody, any president, whoever is in charge can easily change that with a stroke of a pen.
As we see, the Grand Canyon is more than just a tourist destination. It's a place of origin and identity, one which the government kicked Native people away from. Perhaps I can't speak for everyone, but this caused me to look in the Grand Canyon in a whole new light. With accessible online story maps, Indigenous EJ advocates now have a permanent, easy-to-spread documentary method by which to raise their voices. Digital means provide opportunities to control the way Indigenous are perceived and express their connections to a broader audience. Sammy Spiegel states that visual storytelling invites vastly new ways of seeing, both serving as evidence and conversation starters in the Indigenous EJ movement. Hence, visual storying becomes a powerful tool for elucidating deep cultural and lived experiences. In my research, I came across 4 conclusions. First, while I initially predicted a complete trend shift from traditional to digital, I realize now that it's not so black and white. Oral storytelling to this day is alive and vital to Indigenous identity. However, if we keep destroying nature, like the Karuk, tribes may be prevented from transmitting their knowledge and culture, and it will die out. Second, while oral and digital storytelling are 2 different trends, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Story map and films are powerful ways to broadcast the voice of elders, document their knowledge, while empowering youth to take their identity as activists. There is a definite overlap in praxis. Third, in talking with activists, I discovered their concerns with the over-romanticism of imagery in digital storytelling. Since a photograph or video is just a snapshot in time, it can fail to properly depict everyday problems and concerns of the Indigenous. Finally, there is no way to fully comprehend the significance of storytelling until you explore a story or talk with an Indigenous EJ advocates. Even after hours of academic research, I found that I was most personally touched watching videos of Indigenous video recordings, observing story maps, and talking with advocates. Right now, the direction of storytelling is at its critical point. With COVID-19, existential environmental issues like climate change, and continued political persecution, personal oral storytelling sessions are at risk and must be preserved. Though digital videos are on the rise, I believe storytelling is best when there is an intersection between the two. I know it's really easy to watch this and move on. After all, it's week 8 and everyone's overloaded with work. However, I created a reference sheet with different stories you can observe. If you found my presentation interesting in the slightest, please take an in depth dive into one of these. I promise you won't be disappointed. Thank you so much, and I am super excited to read all your questions.